For this edition of the Create Classroom video series, we wanted to talk a little bit about the activity. And I've kind of been waiting a little while because I wanted to get some actual data and some actual video to show you of students actively being involved in class. And there's a couple of different ways that could manifest, and so we want to talk about a few of those today. One of those ways is the obvious physical activity, getting students up and moving around. And so there's different ways to do that. We'll show you some video here in a minute of that. Another way is just to get students actively involved, maybe not necessarily physically in the classroom, but actively involved in the world around them. And so giving them a chance to have opportunities where they actively engage in the things that they're involved in. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to jump right into some of the video on physically active in class. So we recently had our Sociology Olympics, and what this was an opportunity, one, to get the students up and moving around. They sit a lot in high school, and there's a lot of that going on even in my classes. And so I wanted to give them a chance to do something unique and different. So they got to do some sort of minute-to-win-it games, but they learned about competition and how does competition affect groups? How does encouragement and that kind of thing affect things? They got to build paper airplanes. So they're really incorporating sort of an understanding of physics and the way the world works. I know that's stretching, but at the same time, they're getting up and physically moving around, trying to win the competition. Active is not simply a physical activity. I mean, we've done things in class, obviously like the Olympics, where they're getting up and doing these fun activities. We've done team building activities, which have been great in sociology especially. I've done it in ComApps, debate to a lesser extent, but these are things that build these sort of connections, and students are getting up and being physically active. But there's also an activity of making the kids think beyond the classroom, and so that's really another part of this. I want them to think about how they can be active in the real world. How can they translate this beyond just the walls of this classroom? But in general, speaking about the physical activity, students are actively physically engaged. It helps them to be more willing to communicate. And there have been a number of things that we've tried, and I intend to try some more next semester with psychology. You know, the real thing about activity is that active is physical, but active is also just engaged. It's just involved. And so it's really kind of an extension of student voice in some ways. Where student voice, we talk about the idea of engaging students in things that they can affect society around them. With active engagement, with activity, we're talking about students actually getting in the community and doing things. I guess another way to look at active that's not a component of being in the classroom, and this is how I measure if my students are learning, if my students are actively, I keep saying active, if my students are actually getting the material, and is it resonating with them, is it sticking with them? And the way that I measure that is, are they actively going home and talking to their parents? And I hear quite often when I contact parents and they're like, you know, my kid was talking about this at the dinner table. They always talk about what's going on in class, or they really shape things, the way that they view things. I've had kids come back to me after a psychology class and say, hey, you know, I really want to major in psychology or minor in psychology when I go to college, and making those connections. So active is not necessarily just getting up and physically moving around. It doesn't even have to be writing a letter to your congressman. Active could be, are you thinking these things through? Are the students actively continuing with the learning beyond the doors of the classroom? And I think a great measure for that is, what do the kids sit around at the dinner table and say to their parents at night? Are they actually sharing out, hey, we learned this in Mr. Laram's class. Did you know that this guy did this? Or did you know that they did this? Or did you know that if these two components go together? You know, there's so many different ways in which we can measure active learning. And I think that's a big component, is that the Create Classroom hopefully inspires students to be active in the classroom, but also outside of its walls.